Hi, my name is Gabriel Jaramillo. I'm the Director of Community Development for Habitat Central Arizona. We're here with Jason Barlow, CEO of Habitat Central Arizona, T. Van Hook, CEO of Habitat Tucson. And back on October 9th, Habitat for Humanity Tucson, Habitat Central Arizona, and in partnership with the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, hosted the 2020 Equitable Development Forum. T, what is equitable development, and why was this forum so important?
Oh, thanks for asking. This is the fourth year that we've had an Equitable Development Forum. It's so critical because our history has mandated or dictated some things that are unique now. In the past, there was redlining where people couldn't get loans. There were neighborhoods that excluded people of color. All of these things for generations. So we have a gap that lasts generations in family wealth and in poverty. And so if we're going to look at housing development and affordable housing, we have to do it through an equity lens. We have to say, how do we promote these families that didn't have opportunities, not just yesterday, but a previous generation and a generation before that? How do we promote the ability for everyone to have safe, decent housing? And in Habitat's world, home ownership as a means to ending poverty.
Thank you. And Jason, as a participant, what were some of the biggest takeaways for you?
Well, thank you, Gabriel, and thank you, T. I was absolutely blown away by the amount of participation that we had. I mean, it was incredible. I mean, we had Jonathan Reckford, the CEO of Habitat International, do the keynote presentation at the very beginning, and he really kind of set the tone for what we were trying to achieve. And I was really very impressed with all of the different people that we had participate in the seminar. We had city officials, we had various organizations, we had volunteers, we had Habitat people, and I was really impressed with just the care and concern that all of these people demonstrated about trying to solve or come up with some real tangible things that we can work on to continue to beat back this affordable housing challenge. And we're so desperately behind this, as T alluded to, in not only Tucson, but up in our neck of the woods, the Maricopa County area. We have so many families that have been disenfranchised and or just so many barriers have been placed in their way. And that equitable housing and access to capital and all the things that surround it are so important that we all just meet like this forum to discuss and to come up with solutions. So I thought it was from that sense, it was very meaningful.
Thank you, Jason. And T, Jason, what do you think? What are we hoping to accomplish from this forum?
I know our long-term goal has been to raise awareness, to bring partnerships together so people aren't duplicating effort across the state, and to make sure that the information and resources that we have in the two largest jurisdictions in Pima and Maricopa County are available, if it's through Zoom or through electronic means, available to everyone across the state, rural, native communities, communities with all different types of problems and issues, but that we can come up with solutions that work in every part of the state. And so opening up that dialogue is the first step in doing that. We know from lots of movements that have gone through the state, coming to consensus on the problem and some solutions, which is what we work to do at the forum, is really have a consensus about where we're at and where we need to go. And I know there have been follow-on conversations, and we certainly will have some follow-on conversations for the after the forum. The other thing that I thought was great is we asked everyone to do an I will statement. I will do this for affordable housing. And that's from the planners that were involved in the forum. There were builders, there were engineers, all the way down to folks who live in affordable housing projects. Or I should say all the way up to people who live in affordable housing projects. And everybody had something they could do to really forward the movement. And I think that was extremely powerful.
Yeah, I agree, T. And Gabriel and I were just talking about, we took the notes, we took the report that came out of this forum, and we have 3 pages, single-spaced, of action items that we can pursue, specific action items, such as, at least in our small affiliate, we can provide financial counseling to families, to more families. We do it for the families that are in our program, but we have the bandwidth and the capability to expand that, to provide financial counseling to many other families that could use that. And there were, just like you said with the I will statements, there were so many just individual action items that people committed to, that I think if we could just continue to drill down on those, we'll make a dent in this nasty issue that we're all dealing with right now.
And we would love to compare notes, because Ann did the same thing. She went through actionable items. She categorized them. We talked in 4 different categories at the forum. Access to capital, communities of opportunity, preserving and promoting or building more affordable housing, and I don't remember the 4th, but we had land use. And so those were really important categories. And sometimes over in the communities of opportunity, they talked about land use, and in land use they talked about communities of opportunity or the built product. So and how do you finance it was in every single group. And so cross-referencing those and making sure that the people in various groups understand the resources in the others, I think is going to be really key as we move forward with this initiative.
I agree. And there, there's a huge spectrum, right, T, from all the way from homelessness to home ownership. And it's great to bring people together to address problems along the entire spectrum. So I think that was something that was really meaningful for me to see. So thank you. It was a great partnership with your affiliate, T, and Tucson to collaborate on this. And Federal Home Loan Bank was there as a sponsor. So it was just a wonderful event.
Yeah. And we're really looking forward to moving the advocacy agenda forward as a group. And I think we have a powerful voice.
It was definitely an amazing event. Thank you both for helping put it together. T, you and your team organizing this over the last couple of years. So thank you guys for that. Another amazing part of it is that we got to hear from Habitat International CEO Jonathan Reckford, and then we'd like to share the comments not only of Jonathan, but the open discussion that we had from that forum with everybody. And we really hope you enjoy and take something out of it. Thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you.
Carol, thank you again for that kind introduction. Thank you for your words as well and your leadership. And thanks to all of you for gathering today. I so wish we could be together in person and look forward to when that is possible again. My guess is that many of you share some of the same challenges we face at Habitat for Humanity in actually convincing people on why housing should be a higher priority. And that was difficult enough before the coronavirus. I've often said that the issue of home affordability was relatively invisible in our society. Those who made decisions while living in comfortable homes were often unaware of the daily struggles of the millions of people who can't afford a safe and decent place in which to live. But when adult children and middle-class families began to find that housing costs were beyond their reach, more people began to pay attention. We were better able to make the case that providing opportunities for decent housing that is affordable can lead to positive changes like better education outcomes and the ability for families to make forward-looking choices. We saw people get more excited about the positive effects of home that extend deep into communities. They could see how proper shelter creates jobs, revitalizes neighborhoods, and attracts employers. It began to make more sense to more people that stable housing increases consumer spending and government revenues and lowers the risk of foreclosure, all while bringing transformative benefits to families and developing resilient neighborhoods. But now, as you've heard, I'm sure from other speakers, the situation has gotten worse. The COVID medical emergency has become an economic catastrophe that has exacerbated the housing crisis. Before the pandemic, home prices in 2/3 of US cities had hit record highs. 1 in 6 families in the United States pay half or more of their income on their rent or mortgage. Half. For many, this means choosing between having a safe place to live and having enough money for food, transportation, healthcare, or other basic needs. That's why at Habitat, we developed our national Cost of Home Advocacy campaign. No place in the world has solved housing problems without the government playing a role, whether through policy or subsidy. The lack of housing is a math problem. The cost of land, the cost of materials, and the cost of labor make it very difficult to build housing that is affordable for low or moderate income families. For example, I've heard many of our affiliates talking about the rising cost of lumber, which has skyrocketed over the past 6 months, up 50%. People didn't expect interest rates to dip, but they did. But that coupled with so many people wanting to improve their living spaces and the unanticipated growth in demand for single family housing has made our challenge even worse. And our supply of single family housing is at the lowest point since they've been keeping the records. For low income families, it's even tougher. The market is simply not working for those who are struggling to pay the bills. Habitat started a lot of market development work many years ago in other countries focused on reducing the barriers that stop people from improving their own housing conditions. We're now looking at some of those same approaches here in the US because I would argue we have market failure. The market is not providing enough housing given the need. And we believe it's going to take a multi-sector approach to develop the policies and make the changes that are needed. I just want to share one of my favorite stories about advocacy and how passionate people can change hearts and minds. Pastor and former Habitat for Humanity International board member, Tony Campolo, tells a story about a town council considering a state hospital proposal for halfway houses to serve emotionally and psychologically disturbed people transitioning out of the hospital. Half of the town in Norris, Pennsylvania showed up to protest, saying, "Not in my backyard." No crazy people in their neighborhood, the crowd demanded. The council was set. The vote was unanimous to reject the proposal. Can you imagine the look on every face when none other than Mother Teresa walked through the door? "In the name of Jesus, don't shut out these children of God," she pleaded. The crowd was stunned. The room was silent except for her beseeching voice as she knelt in front of the council. "Please make room for them in this community. I beg you, in the name of Jesus." Imagine the pregnant pause as the cameras rolled and the reporters got their pads ready. For a moment, no one moved. Then a single voice from the council called out, "Move we rescind the motion." Not only did the town council reverse its ruling, but amazingly, of the 500 angry people gathered in the room, not one person uttered a word of objection. Why? Because Mother Teresa spoke with authority. She earned that authority in Calcutta, giving up all for the poor in the streets. Now, I'm not equating any of us to Mother Teresa, but after more than 40 years of building homes, communities, and hope, Habitat for Humanity has also earned the authority to lift up the voices of those in need of decent shelter. Each of you has earned that authority as well, but we have to speak up. So through our 5-year advocacy campaign, we have committed to mobilize our local Habitat organizations, our partners, our volunteers, and community members across the country to find affordable housing solutions and help create the policies that will allow 10 million individuals to meet their most basic housing needs. So what are we advocating for? There are 4 pillars of the campaign, and I see them as critical to all of us in housing. First, we need to increase the supply and preservation of affordable homes. All communities need systems in place to help homeowners and renters to be able to afford and keep their homes. This is especially true in the face of sudden hardship, or when neighborhood improvements lead to rising rents, or property taxes that threaten to displace current residents. We must advocate for policies that increase the production, preservation, and accessibility of homes that are affordable for lower income households. Great example comes from your state. In 2018, the Arizona legislature appropriated $15 million to the Arizona Housing Trust Fund. This was one of the largest investments toward housing and homelessness the state has seen in almost a decade. And I would argue not nearly enough, but still progress. Habitat Central Arizona signed a letter of
this week.
No, he has been no contact.
Oh, we've got a guest. And led the advocacy efforts of the Arizona Housing Coalition, including its coalition at the Capitol. In another instance, Habitat for Humanity International vigorously advocated for U.S. affiliates to receive funding through the CARES Act, and several Arizona affiliates were able to pay staff members with funds from the Paycheck Protection Program. We are grateful that Habitat Tucson has been able to help homeowners make their payments and also hire contractors to complete houses under construction. Generous donors, grant funding, and designation from United Way for a portion of their CARES Act dollars have made that possible. 9 families have moved into their homes, even with the crisis. Recently, we've added some additional strategies to preserve affordable homes because in
and he's like, oh, I've just been chilling.
We are seeing actually a net loss of affordable housing because tax credit financed housing is rolling off and being upgraded into market rate housing. Preventing defaults and foreclosures for lower income homeowners through expanded short-term mortgage assistance, housing counseling, and sustainable forbearance options. This is obviously huge as we're seeing massive numbers of families across the country facing potential eviction or foreclosure. Preventing rental evictions through broader renter assistance, forbearance, legal protections for tenants, and emergency rental assistance. The second pillar of the campaign is to equitably increase access to credit. Credit is difficult, if not impossible, for many households to access. Communities of color have a long history of systematic exclusion from lending and are more likely to be targets of predatory credit today. One of the many consequences of this history is that Black households have less wealth and less access to intergenerational support for a down payment. We must work together to advocate for policies that increase and broaden access to safe and sound credit for underserved populations and communities, prioritizing policies that help close the home ownership gap for communities of color. Third, we're seeking to optimize land use. For decades, racially restrictive covenants, redlining, and other forms of racial discrimination prevented Black households and other people of color from purchasing homes or renting in communities with well-resourced schools, appreciating home values, and other opportunities. One of the clearest legacies of past racial discrimination and continuing housing inequities in the US is today's stark gap in home ownership rates. As I referenced, Black households at 44% versus white households at 73.7%. The nearly 30-point gap grew over the past 2 decades, resulting in significantly less housing stability, economic security, and wealth for Black families. Many communities in Arizona have adopted redlining policies, even if they're not enforced. The covenants prohibit the sales of homes to Jewish, Black, Asian, and Hispanic families, as well as Indians, which is the wording used to refer to Native Americans. For over 30 years now, Habitat Tucson has had a tribal agreement that has resulted in about 10% of the families served being Native Americans. We have a long way to go across the US in general, and in Arizona specifically. The Urban Institute's Inclusion Index shows that in 2016, Phoenix ranked 266 out of 274 cities nationally for overall inclusion. Mesa ranked 236th, and Tucson ranked 177th. News was better in other Arizona cities. Tempe was 98th, Scottsdale 57th, and Chandler 31st. Local land use regulations play an important role in advancing health, safety, and community well-being, but overly restrictive zoning requirements can drive up the cost of home building. Families that Habitat for Humanity and other housing providers can serve. Our advocacy campaign emphasizes support for policies related to land acquisition, use, and development, so we can bring down the cost of building and fully reflect community needs. Local habitat groups all across the country are working to improve land use policies that are more inclusive. We're seeking to remove costly regulatory barriers that stand in the way of developing affordable housing and inclusive communities. For example, Habitat Metro Maryland successfully advocated for the passage of an amendment that significantly loosens zoning and building requirements for accessory dwelling units, such as garage apartments or backyard cottages in the county. Additionally, last year, the county passed a racial equity and social justice policy to ensure that all their policy decisions, including land use, are viewed through an equity lens. Habitat Metro Maryland was highly supportive. The Portland City Council passed a dramatic overhaul of its zoning code to allow more housing density in the city's residential neighborhoods. The new policy allows duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes to be built in neighborhoods currently zoned for single-family homes. That means organizations like Habitat will be able to build more affordable housing. The last pillar of the campaign is to ensure access to and development of communities of opportunity. Investment is urgently needed in distressed and disinvested communities that are disproportionately home to people of color. Affordable homes must be built in environmentally sound areas with access to economic and social opportunities and viable transportation. Upfront investments that ensure homes are well constructed, energy efficient, and mitigated against disasters further help with home retention and sustainability. The campaign will support policies that protect and strengthen neighborhoods and enable communities to thrive. At the end of the first year of the campaign, 1.5 million people now have improved access to home affordability, and $815 million has been accessed or allocated for home affordability through policy and systems change. Advocacy requires tenacity. I was told that Arizona is a hands-off state. Issues like inclusionary zoning, offset incentives, and voluntary donations to housing trust funds have been deemed unconstitutional. That's exactly what advocacy was intended to address. Changing and creating policies that support housing affordability may require a full-out statewide campaign that reaches down into every county and municipality. We must advocate on the local, state, and federal levels if we're going to change hearts and minds. Putting in place policies that remove barriers should make it easier to build housing that's affordable. We must also consider the less formal barriers of economic segregation. I actually think one of the biggest barriers in society today is how much we have divided ourselves on economic lines. If there's not enough affordable housing out there for individuals who provide all the services to operate communities, the implications are negative. We all pay the cost of overcrowding, lack of access to transportation, and medical care. COVID has made that very clear. Ultimately, housing advocacy is not about policies, governments, agencies, organizations like Habitat. It's about people whose lives are changed when they're part of supportive communities that help them thrive. If we're going to heal the pain in this country, we're going to do it by treating all people with respect, by investing in communities, and by crafting meaningful reforms that can ensure opportunities for all. I've talked about a lot of numbers and policies. Let me tell you what a difference a decent place to live in a caring community made in the life of my friend Boris. This might be my favorite story from my book. Boris grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, other side of the country, and he grew up in a neighborhood informally called The Hole. And you can imagine what a neighborhood named that was like. Shootings, violence. His family had no indoor plumbing. He had no place to study. They were highly overcrowded. And Boris was struggling. He was acting out in school. He wasn't getting good grades. And he was one of those kids that could have so easily been written off. But he told me he was blessed in multiple ways. When he was in third grade, his mother qualified to buy a Habitat for Humanity home. And they moved from The Hole to Optimus Park. And I love the imagery of that. And it turns out Boris was actually a very bright young man. And he got good mentoring, got good support, did really well in school, earned a full scholarship to Davidson College, ended up getting an MBA and going into banking and then affordable housing. He now works with senior care and developing opportunities for seniors to live in good conditions. And Boris is one of those people when you're around him who just makes the world better. He is, as far as I know, the first person who grew up in a Habitat home to serve on our international board of directors. And I share that not because he's such a success, though he is, but because I want everyone to think about all the other Borises out there who have so much to give if they could just grow into all that God intended for them, if they just had that opportunity, had that chance. And so over the years, I've discussed with so many housing experts ideas that sounded both reasonable and audacious. But the stakes are so high right now. So we must create an urgency about this problem that is no longer invisible. There will always be crises that bring us together and ones that divide us. With concern for everyone, as we look at our long-term response to the COVID crisis and to the issues of race in this country, we must make a commitment to come together to create housing opportunities that will help build strong families and strong communities. Later in this conference, you'll be asked to write out your pledge on what you will do to move forward the issue of adequate and affordable housing for all. I want you to think about that pledge and decide what you can do, what you must do, so that there will be more Borises in this world and we can create the kind of communities we all want to be a part of. Then use your authority to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And welcome to Arizona, if even virtually. We're all here. It's a wonderful day. I'm Jason Barlow. If I haven't met you, I'm the president and CEO of Habitat for Humanity Central Arizona. One of the co-partners in this with T and Tucson, the Habitat in Tucson. Thank you, Carol, for your great remarks right ahead of Jonathan's. And we're going to open it up for questions for 5-10 minutes. And we're going to take those in the chat, and I'll moderate as best and clumsily as I can to get those questions to Jonathan. So if while you're thinking about a question to ask in chat, let me just ask you, Jonathan, you mentioned COVID. COVID's been a big deal here as well. How has Habitat been doing in the midst of COVID, and what has been the effect, and how have you adapted?
Jason, thank you. And thanks for your leadership. It is, we have never faced anything like COVID, and I'm sure all of you are in the same situation. We have had natural disasters, we've had man-made disasters in different parts of the world, but we've never had the whole world impacted at the same time. So this has been massively disruptive. I think the most devastating impact has been in some of the international countries that have still been shut down. And I think as tough as things are in the US, and they are tough, it has, if you think about a place like Cambodia or Ethiopia or some of our bigger programs, not only has COVID hit them, they've lost their tourism, they've lost their remittances. So this is the economic impact of COVID is devastating. And we are seeing maybe losing 10 to 15 years of development progress. I read just recently, we're seeing potentially just this year, 100 million people going into extreme poverty. And so that is just heartbreaking. Here in the US, I serve on one of the regional Federal Reserve boards and heard a term that I thought really captures it. And they called it the less than economy. And if you think about, the mathematical less than sign, that really captures it. For people who have good housing and who are knowledge workers and who can do their work remotely and virtually, they actually haven't been impacted. Most of the problems with COVID have been inconvenience. If you're on the other half of the economy, whether you're in the service and you have to be out in the community to do your work, or maybe don't have a knowledge-based job, this has been a disaster. Obviously, we are seeing record levels of unemployment. We're seeing permanent job loss, and we are seeing great risk both for health and livelihoods for so many of our members of our communities. So for Habitat specifically, we've had to adapt pretty quickly. I gave one example. We've had to move away from volunteers, and for those of you who know us, a central piece of Habitat, though a small part of the actual house production, is driven by our volunteer engagement. And we are seeing, we've used more contractors and partners and professional staff, and sometimes only our highly skilled regular volunteers to complete projects, but are not starting as many projects. The numbers are better than I would have expected, and we're grateful that donors have hung in there. But there is no question, we expect this to be a long, slow recovery, and it's impacting really all elements of our work. So it is disheartening, but construction has been exempted as an essential activity in many places, and actually outdoor construction is one of the safer activities that can be done. So we are still building, but having to build in different ways.
Thank you, Jonathan. And you mentioned the number of families that got keys to new homes in Tucson. 12 families in Central Phoenix did the same thing. So we were awful proud of that occurring. I'm going to ask T to get into the chat room and ask a couple more questions. T?
We have a question from a local planning official about auxiliary dwelling units And some thought that they only benefit the wealthy homeowner that can afford to put an ADU on their property. Could you address that issue and how they support low-income households?
Yeah, thank you, T. Nice to see you. There's no magic bullet. I think we're going to need all of the above. So I think when we see these examples, to me, really in all of your communities, we need the builders and developers, the banks, the mayors, and the nonprofit community and voices of the community to be at the table together saying, what would it take to meaningfully increase the supply of housing? And the nice thing about ADUs is it's a quick way to increase density in communities of opportunity that typically have better schools and better transportation access and access to jobs. So it does benefit, on the one side, the existing families, but it also opens up rental units in those communities. And I think that's the biggest plus. But I would certainly agree as well that it is insufficient. And I think in some ways, the big challenge is to increase density in the right places. We don't need density everywhere, but we need more density where there's access to transit and where in the right places. And so if you look at the maps of most cities, 70 to 80% of the land is zoned single family only. And if we can, we're not talking high rises everywhere, but just small increments of density along the bus corridors, along the transit corridors, could make a big difference in terms of just increasing supply. The other side that could make the private sector happy is making it faster and easier to get building done. And that would help the nonprofit builders as well. So I think it's going to take a whole series of approaches.
Yeah, it is. You're right.
Our next question is about Habitat's partnership with public housing authorities and how we work together to increase the supply of housing.
Yeah, the public housing authorities obviously are critical partners in this process. And I'll speak from Habitat, but more broadly, one thing I've seen is the biggest hurdle usually is land. And if you look at most cities, they actually have a fair amount of land. The question is, who's got control of it? In my hometown of Atlanta, you've got 5 different. You've got a land trust, you've got the housing authority, you've got the school board, you've got I'm blanking, there's a Community Development Act organization and an Economic Development organization. Between those, there's a massive amount of land. And so if we could get more of the existing land owned by the government used for housing, that's going to be one of the fastest ways we could increase supply. One thing that Habitat has often done with public housing authorities is Habitat's niche is affordable home ownership. Though, as I talked about our advocacy campaign, we are advocating for the entire spectrum of housing. But one thing that we have seen is that in partnerships with housing authorities, having the potential for families to move out of subsidized rental into home ownership creates a path. Even if it's a small percentage of the families, I actually think it is important that there is a pathway out. And of course, any family that is able to move out of public housing and purchase a home opens up another affordable rental unit. So we've seen some really nice partnerships around land and as well around mixed income communities. And it was implied, but I'd say more explicitly, the social mobility data from Raj Chetty and his partners is really so compelling because it really showed that low-income families who live in mixed income communities have relatively decent social mobility opportunities, but low-income families in concentrated poverty have almost zero social mobility. And so we know the right answer is mixed income, mixed use, but it will require thinking differently. And I think some of the more progressive housing authorities have figured out how do we not concentrate all the affordable housing public units all in the same place, but spread them out.
That's good. Thank you, Jonathan. We have a question. I'll combine a couple of them. How do we ensure that housing policies actually protect and uplift low-income communities of color? As mentioned in the chat, you're not looking at the chat, there's a lot going on in here. Simply increasing housing supply hasn't been shown to necessarily alleviate housing disparities.
Yeah, I think it's going to have to come in 2 ways. One, increasing housing supply will help because if we have enough housing, that will help affordability, which will help everybody if you've got a broader supply. Because one of the shocking things is the sort of on a rent per square foot, housing is still very expensive. Low quality housing rental is actually still very expensive in a lot of markets and communities. And you pay, they're not getting necessarily great value. So I think it has to come in two fronts. One is, as I talked about in my talk, how do we increase opportunities in the communities of opportunities? So how do we make it easier? And this is where it gets really hard. You know, I live in the city of Atlanta, but on the north side of town. And if you try to build apartments that are affordable, people who are otherwise friendly and liberal get very defensive, and the sort of not in my backyard takes over in a huge way. So that's where we really need social advocacy to open up access in the communities that have the stronger schools, have better transit, have some of the pieces. The other side then is continuing to invest in historically underinvested communities, but do it in a way that is inclusive and doesn't just displace. So if we could open up opportunities so where we have displacement, they can go into better economic neighborhoods with better schools. That's one piece. The other side is how do you create mixed income in both sides? So if we can do that in a more equitable way, I think everybody could win. But I think there's going to have to be some intentionality. And down payment assistance is a big piece, we think. Habitat disproportionately serves, obviously, we start with low income. And if you look at the makeup of low and moderate income families, we serve primarily 30 to 80% of area median income. That has a higher proportion of people of color in it. And so I don't think there are any easy answers to this, but I believe it's going to have to be intentional. It's going to have to deal with zoning. It's going to have to deal with some elements of access to credit and down payment assistance in ways that do create the opportunity, at least, for people to have home ownership. And we certainly don't believe everyone should be homeowners, but we do believe it's an important piece of the mix, and historically been a way for low-income families to build an intergenerational asset over time.
Jonathan, thank you for that. There's a lot of chatter in the box, and one of the questions is, are there examples, are there communities, is there a place in the US that's been successful in moving forward equitable housing policy and practice? And can you share some of those with us?
Yeah, I think there are small examples. I think there's some promising ones too that are interesting. Like the one I shared, Twin Cities, Minneapolis passed a change that Habitat Twin Cities was very active in helping lead, where they did a citywide zoning change that allowed not high density, but duplex, triplex, or quads to be built anywhere in the city. And the belief is that's going to allow small but meaningful increase in density. Now we've got to see what happens from that, but that's a step because land is such a huge part of the cost of housing. So obviously if we can get more density per lot, that's going to help with affordability. And those are pretty efficient ways to get relatively low cost additional units built. Austin, Texas is doing a similar, very similar zoning law. So those are a couple specific ones. But so often, ultimately, it really is that local leadership. It's always going to be about local leaders stepping up and saying, hey, we need to do this. And interestingly, it's coming more and more from the business community, because if you look at a lot of the highest costs, California has some of the most egregious examples. It's gotten so expensive that you can't hire enough service workers. And when I've been out in the Bay Area in San Francisco, I'll interview the Uber or Lyft drivers. I'll talk to people I interact with. Construction workers are commuting in from 2 hours and then sleeping 4 to a room in a hotel room for 3 or 4 nights and then going back home. Or people are driving in from incredibly long distances. Now that's terrible for the environment. That's actually terrible for their families. It's a huge financial hardship. If you think about the true cost of rent being your rent or mortgage plus your utilities plus your cost to get to work, that's a gigantic tax. And so, but it's ultimately unsustainable. So the best model is how do we actually create models where most people can live reasonably close to where they work, and then ultimately, I would argue everybody wins in that process. But it's been a relatively recent phenomenon in the last 50 years that we have moved towards further and further away from mixed income. If you think about pre-transportation, everyone had to live where they could walk or take a buggy to the factory or to the piece of work. So cities organically were mixed income, mixed use. And it's been relatively recent in history that we have moved away from that model. But I don't pretend any of that's easy.
you, Jonathan. And I was given the high sign. We have time for one last question. I will mention, though, you brought up, you were here about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, speaking at the Wrigley Global Sustainability Conference at ASU. And you brought up at that time how important it was to build affordable housing along the light rail extensions and so forth. And that's what we're seeing in Phoenix, right? We're seeing this massive lineup of traffic going west because they're building, people drive to where they can buy and afford, and it's way out west now. So we're living that and seeing that. There is a lot of positive development, though, for affordable housing along this new light rail headed south out of Phoenix. So that's exciting. So this is an interesting question. Last one. Is there a role for promoting home sharing to increase housing capacity without capital costs, keep people in housing, decrease loneliness, especially for senior homeowners? Home sharing. What do you think about that?
Yeah, you know, my general view is we should be open to kind of every good idea. In a way, home sharing is a different, I've seen versions of ADUs where you've got a single person living in a relatively large house and they move into the ADU and then rent out the house so a family can take advantage of that larger living space. But I do think loneliness is one of the epidemics in our country, and we're seeing deaths by, and COVID sadly has greatly increased that issue. So I think you've got to sort out the safeguarding issues and the protections and make sure people aren't being taken advantage of. But I do think we're seeing it there are a lot of interesting models, mostly driven by high cost metros of kind of, you know, young adult dormitory type living, which is one side of home sharing. But at the other end, I do think there are more opportunities for families to share spaces, or for people, particularly, you know, single and older adults, to rent out. It goes back to almost the boarding house models of long ago. So I think with proper protections, it's actually a great way to solve two problems if it's done well.
Thank you, Jonathan, for being here in Arizona. We appreciate your comments and your insight, and the amazing work that Habitat is doing all around the world. We have 1,178 affiliates in every state and 70 overseas, 70 nations that participate in Habitat projects. So thank you for your leadership to that. And I'm going to turn it back over to Tara. Thank you, Jonathan.
Great to be with you all. Thanks for the work you're doing.
Claps all around, whether virtual or actual. Thank you so much for that, Jonathan. And Jason, thanks. And T, thanks for fielding all those wonderful questions.